Good morning, everyone. We're going to have coffee soon, don't worry. But thank you for coming. Today on December 6th at COP28, we're delighted that you're here. And in the Pavilion of Sustainable Agriculture of the Americas, this is a project every year that is sponsored by the Ministers and Ministries of Agriculture of the Americas, with the support and coordination of the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. And we're really happy that you're here at COP28 with us. We have a wonderful panel starting very soon, and I'm going to just turn it over to Roy Peter, who's with the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and he will kick it off. But one of the interesting things is that this year at COP28, we have seen a huge demand for knowledge and information about how to move our livestock sectors, not only in the Americas, but globally, to lower emissions systems. And a lot of those conversations are happening here in our pavilion. We have at least half of all of the scheduled events here in our pavilion have something to do with livestock. So the sector is really rising to the challenge. We're bringing solutions. And we're going to hear right now about some very interesting and good solutions from Roy Peter and the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Thank you, Roy.
So good morning, everybody, and thanks to IICA for hosting this event here in your pavilion. It's fantastic to be back here again. We were made use of the IICA pavilion, the Sustainable Agriculture of the American Pavilion, last year, and it's a pleasure to be back this year in Dubai. So, as Margaret mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and we are a multi-stakeholder platform that works around the world, currently in 25 countries, setting ambitious targets to reduce the impact of beef, both in climate terms, but also equally, I think, importantly, in biodiversity terms, in animal welfare terms, and this year we're also setting a social impact goal to add to that. And I think when you look at those four goals and the interrelationships between those things, that is what sustainability is about. It's where those things all connect with each other that you find true sustainability. When GRSB was established some 12 years ago now, we set global principles and criteria. And again, we talked within those about the holistic approach that we need to take to solving problems. And we hear today a lot of simplistic rhetoric around livestock and around sustainability. But the fact is, these things aren't simple, because if they were simple, we would have solved them a long time ago. And it's only by joining up the various components of sustainability and all of the partners, and that's why we're a multi-stakeholder organization, that you can truly make progress. So we have, within the organization, within our membership, we have producers, so farmers and ranchers right at the bottom. We have the processors who are buying the cattle and turning that into the beef that you buy. We have all the input providers, the allied industries. We have the retailers, both the restaurant retailers and the supermarket retailers. We have the civil society, the NGOs and the academics who provide us with expertise and challenge us to do more. And we have national initiatives, because we recognize right at the beginning that beef production is very complicated, and we need representation in all of the different countries, because beef production is so varied around the world. So I'd like to introduce my panel now. We've got Mitchell Zarate from the Canadian Cattle Association. Mitchell is a leader, right, of your climate initiatives, and can bring a great perspective from the Canadian ranchers and farmers who are producing beef on climate there. Then we have Sheila Guevara. Sheila is from Brazil. She has two hats. She is sustainability lead for Seara, and she is climate lead for JBS. And I know Sheila from many years ago, because when we first met, Sheila was actually leading the national roundtable in Brazil. What at that time was called GTPS, is recently rebranded, but it's called the Brazilian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef today. And she has got experience of that. Then she went into animal health, then she went into animal nutrition, and now she's back on the sustainability side. So a great, great background for this discussion. And then we have Madeline Hall. Thanks, Madeline, for stepping up at the last moment, because we had Mary Thomas above your head. We have Mary Thomas. She was going to be here today, but unfortunately was unable to make it to the pavilion this morning. So Madeline has stepped up from New Zealand. She's also the Senior Environmental and Policy Advisor at Beef and Lamb New Zealand, and is focusing particularly on the climate targets that Beef and Lamb New Zealand have. As you probably have heard, the government of New Zealand has set ambitious targets, and it's up to Beef and Lamb to work out how do farmers, producers in New Zealand meet those targets, and how do you measure against those targets. So let's start with a first question to you, Mitchell. I mean, a lot of countries have set a climate goal. Canada, you do have in your Canadian Roundtable, you have a set of targets. Can you tell us a bit about your climate target and how that relates to what producers are doing?
Is this on? Yeah. Thanks, Rory. Thanks for the question, and thank you to everybody who made it this morning for 9 a.m. And thank you to AICA for being the hub of agriculture and farmers and producers. In this conversation, you mentioned it's important to set strategic and ambitious goals that are driving continual improvement in agriculture and in livestock. And so the approach that Canada has taken on this is building on, you mentioned the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, the National Beef Sustainability Assessment, the Canadian beef industry, and the 7 national beef organizations came together to establish 10 long-term strategic improvement goals that look forward to 2030. And these are across areas of greenhouse gases, emissions, water, animal health, tech and innovation. And these goals really highlight the role of Canadian beef as integral for climate mitigation and biodiversity preservation, innovation, and beef contributing to a sustainable food system. And as it relates to relevant to the climate COP and to emissions, our goal, the Canadian beef industry goal, is to reduce primary production greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 33% by 2030. And so this goal, being an intensity goal, helps us to emphasize the fact that Canada is already producing and providing a relatively low emission beef to the world. And this intensity goal is going to help us continue to do this. And the way we look at it, having an intensity-based goal allows us to, or helps us to avoid a shifting of burden, where an absolute goal might mean an absolute reduction of the Canadian beef herd to reduce emissions, but this intensity-based goal lets Canada, if Canada reduces the herd size, the demand for global protein will be filled by potentially countries with a higher emissions footprint in beef. And this would, in the grand scheme of things, leave the world actually worse off in terms of global emissions. And so we like to say at the CCA is we actually need more Canadian beef, not less, and the emissions intensity goal enables us to continue growing in our industry, but it also has some checks and balances that mean we need to continue making incremental improvements and continue to become more efficient. And then through this goal and many of our other goals through the National Beef Sustainability Assessment, it's measured through the NBSA, and benchmarked on 2013 and 14 data, broken down into environmental, economic, and social life cycle analyses. And actually, the first update to the NBSA will be launched in Q1 of 2024 and marks the halfway point to our 2030 goals. And so we're eagerly awaiting the results of those. It is about to be released and hasn't been yet because this NBSA will be peer reviewed and third-party review to enhance the credibility of our numbers. And so we're eagerly awaiting that and hoping to see these incremental improvements.
Great, thanks. And Scott, would you like to join us on the stage? So welcome to Scott Walker from Meat and Livestock Australia. Yeah, it's a huge venue, so thanks for joining us, Scott. Yeah, as I said, from Meat and Livestock Australia, we'll come back to you in a few minutes once you're all mic'd up. But in the meantime, Shayla, so slightly different perspective. You represent a company that's working on emissions in Brazil specifically. Which angle are you looking at most? I mean, the emissions from Brazil, of course, you've got a huge herd in Brazil. Everybody knows about enteric methane emissions, so I guess that is one of the prongs that you're working on. Do you also consider the emissions from deforestation within your remit or not?
Yeah, sure. So, thank you for having us and invitation. It's a pleasure to see you again, Rory, and meet all of those colleagues. I've been working with this topic now, I think 15 years. My first COP was back to 2009, representing the beef sector. So I'm happy to see how far and how long that have we improved. So deforestation and methane are the key most important part of our greenhouse gas inventory in Brazil. So let me cover the methane topic first. We have plenty of many initiatives and multiple initiatives and piloting with some partners, supply input companies in Brazil, but both the research institute. We just launched a couple of weeks ago results of our research from in partnership with IZE, which is the Animal Science Institute from the São Paulo government state in São Paulo, in Brazil, using tannins and saponines in feed additive, and it demonstrate a decrease in 17% of enteric fermentation. But we are running more studies. We were the first one in the largest pilot of Bovaer from DSM. We are also tackling this methane emissions by decrease the age of slaughtering. This is very important for us, and it's play an important role in our accounting. So it's a multiple projects and initiatives so far. There's no one that is specific now that we have. We need to keep trying all of the opportunities in technology. We are another pilot starting now with lemongrass. And I have a copy here because there's the United States has been involved in the Greener Cattle Initiative. And there's another program with the Colorado State University Ag Next program to identify some new knowledge. University of Nebraska partnership to test new precision technology. So I mean, it's a full pack of tools. Then we need to test all of them. I'm sure our colleagues are also trying many of them, having this umbrella and understand what's best for. And deforestation obviously play an important role. We have targets to end deforestation in the Amazon by 2025. There's a number of initiatives going on in Brazil, so I'm happy to cover later. I don't want to take all of the time.
Last year we saw the launch of one of those initiatives that JBS is in together with Itaú Bank and a few others, I think. So excellent to hear about what you're doing in Brazil. And you just touched on age at slaughter, so that's obviously an important one, but I I think animal health is a hugely important one as well. And I know you were working at Elanco previously, but some recent figures that came out from the Health for Animals report talk about a fall in disease of 10% in our global livestock herd would result in a reduction of emissions of 800 million tons. Vaccination, it's not a new technology, but vaccination, relatively simple. If we could get a vaccination rate of 60%, which is not massively ambitious, but we're really talking about developing countries where maybe vaccination is not widely adopted. If we could do that, we would increase our productivity by 50%. So there's huge scope there for reducing emissions through better animal health and welfare, and that's why GRSB has a welfare goal. Moving on to Madeline, who's not Mary Thomas, as we've already established. Madeline, the government of New Zealand has set some ambitious targets, and you have to translate those into action with farmers. How does that work, and what does it mean? Are farmers going to go out of business in New Zealand as a result of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be on this panel, and I'm really excited to have a conversation today. So I'm with Beef and Lamb New Zealand, which is a levy body organization funded through the levies accumulated from the slaughter of beef and sheep within New Zealand. So our motto is by farmers and for farmers. As Rory mentioned, a few years ago, the government of New Zealand set some relatively ambitious targets within our domestic climate change policy framework. And a key distinction that they made at the time, which has now been subsequently recommended to be adopted by others in the IPCC, or by the IPCC rather, is actually a split gas target. So the government has made a distinction between emissions reductions requirements for short-lived greenhouse gas emissions, such as methane, as compared to long-lived greenhouse gas emissions, such as CO2 and nitrous oxide. And so, as a result, we have a 10% by 2030 reduction target for methane, and a 24 to 47% reduction target by 2050 for methane, which is a separate target from a net zero target by 2050 for our other greenhouse gas emissions. And this is something that, although we as Beef and Lamb don't agree with the numbers within those targets right now, having a split gas approach is fantastic, right? It's an amazing opportunity to make a really key distinction between how these different greenhouse gases behave in the atmosphere, and thus allow us to better achieve what we actually need to be managing, which is the warming impact of our activities, rather than our emissions directly. So I'm sure all of you are aware, but methane emissions don't need to go to zero to have the same impact as a net zero carbon target. And I feel like this can't be said enough, because it's something that we in New Zealand are really passionate about and actually need to communicate and connect more on. So taking the targets aside, as part of the implementation of those targets, it's a pretty big ask for a lot of our farmers. And so one of the conditions that came into legislation in addition to the targets was actually what was calling a backstop of including agricultural production within our emissions trading scheme. And depending on how you do it, it really wouldn't work very well. Right, in terms of encouraging the adoption of efficient tools and technologies that farmers could be using to actually make a meaningful impact. And so ourselves and a number of other industry, government, and Indigenous peoples partners came together and negotiated a alternative pricing framework for emissions, which was called He Waka Ikanoa. And this partnership presented our framework to the government of the day. And the government kind of looked at it, they did some of their own analysis, changed it a bit, and in those changes, it essentially fell apart over time for a variety of reasons. But one of the key lessons learned from there in terms of implementation is, one, it is really hard to do to develop a farm-level emissions pricing system, right? And second, or there's three lessons actually. The second thing is, in order for a pricing system to be effective, you also need to be having activities that can be adopted by people with a price encouragement, right? And because of the limited tools and technologies available by our farmers, currently the only thing that is ready for the market really is genetics and the adoption of sheep genetics. And so we're waiting eagerly, as everybody is, for some alternative vaccines or other kinds of methane inhibitors. But until those are available, it's really hard for our farmers to take on a price without actually going under. And some of the government modeling suggested that with the proposed relatively low price of, I think it was $15, that would actually put about a quarter of our sheep and beef farmers out of business on day one. So that's something that we struggled really with adopting, and so pushed back, and hence it's kind of been paused as a result. But with that said, Beef and Lamb New Zealand actually has a climate neutral goal by 2050, right? So we're still really committed to finding ways to manage and measure and reduce our emissions over time. And actually one of the key successes as part of He Waka Kanoa was a recognition that our farmers are actually really eager and able to measure and manage their emissions on farm. So as part of the negotiations with the government to design a pricing system, they also put in a requirement to have farmers quote, know their greenhouse gas numbers on farm. And it was a really ambitious goal of having all farmers know this number within a really short kind of 2.5-year time frame. And we were wonderfully impressed by our actions of ourselves and our industry partners to have 97% of our sheep and beef farmers know their number by that deadline, which has been the most successful extension program that we have ever run in the history of our industry, which is a really great testament to how important we find climate change and how imperative it is for us to be taking action and getting our farmers along.
Yeah, thanks, Madeline. And I should mention that for the past 4 years I was living in New Zealand, so I saw a lot of this happening. And that know your number, He Waka Kanoa, by the way, means all in a canoe together, I think. And it's interesting because I don't think all the farmers necessarily felt they were in the same canoe as the government at all times. But yeah, 97% know their number. That's really impressive. And it shows the power of legislation, even if you don't agree with it. Sometimes giving that legislative push does bring about rapid change. There's a lot to talk about from New Zealand, but probably just because I was living there. So if we move on to Scott now, Scott Walker's from MLA, as I mentioned before. You also have a goal, which was actually set by MLA, and it's slightly different to the New Zealand one. So GRSB set our footprint guidelines in 2021, where we talk about a split gas accounting approach, and we encourage all of our members when they're doing a life cycle assessment to use a split gas approach, because you can really determine how much warming is coming from each gas and when that warming is going to peak. So can you talk about the MLA goal, Scott, and whether, what the issues are? Because you set that several years ago, probably before some of the other people did, and maybe you were leading, but maybe it also means you've learned some lessons in the intervening years.
Yeah, for sure. So for everybody's background, I mean, I'm based in Dubai actually. I run the markets from UK, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I'm actually a bit closer to the consumer and competing directly in the market on the marketing side of things. So I'll do my best to fulfill this, but it's obviously something that we think is important to the consumer, and trying to educate obviously the industry all the way through falls on us. Since we set the carbon neutral 2030 target in Australia, I suppose I guess lessons learned has been really we couldn't do anything without the industry's commitment, and that is critical to its success. And we have an ambitious industry who wants to be a world leader. So we've been privileged to have that buy-in and that commitment, which has been sort of key to some of our successes there. This one's ongoing, and as always, and applies to everybody, I think, but significant investment in R&D. It can't be done without that. MLA has done what it can to and continues to do what it can to attract private and public sector funding for its research, development, and adoption initiatives. That's absolutely critical to achieving that carbon neutral goal or getting close. And also, although this falls a little bit outside of our remit, but favourable industry and government policy that allows for business certainty for farmers. So even if all of that technology exists, it's got to be able to be adopted. It's got to make commercial sense. So I think that there is still a lot of work to do in this area, but we're getting further towards that, making it a bit easier for our farmers, our producers to adopt these new technologies that are coming in.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And you saw that we were going to have Mary Thomas Hart here from NCBA. She was unable to make it because of issues with blue zone passes, etc. She will be here next week. But I think it's worth mentioning, while we're on the subject of targets that producers have set, and NCBA represents the grass-fed producers in the United States, that they have a climate neutral target by 2050, which is a massive move of the needle since I first started talking with NCBA in probably around 2013, where they really didn't want to talk about climate at all. And I think it was the realization amongst ranchers that they are being directly impacted by climate change. And you've only got to look at the rainfall figures for the western United States to see what climate change is doing, both to rainfall but also to the river flows and the aquifers, to understand why that suddenly became a more important part of their agenda. And I know you don't represent them, but perhaps do you want to say anything about US targets on climate change? Eric? Because I know there are many, and Eric represents Protein Pact and the North American Meat Institute, so he knows about these things as well.
Yeah. So in the U.S., as you mentioned, NCBA has a climate neutral target, and we work really closely with them and the whole of the industry to help advance environmental progress. We have a goal for our members, working in conjunction with the industry, of setting science-based targets for our members in the packer processor sector. And so our goal is to try to connect the supply chain data and information to be able to have better data, to be able to share that in a meaningful way and work towards those targets.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And I know that the NCBA also did their first life cycle assessment several years ago, and they're now keeping that updated in the same way that Canada is. And the improvements are quite dramatic, and they come from all of the normal husbandry, health, management issues, that farmers, ranchers, producers, farmers everywhere have really always pursued. You do that because it's good for your business. Mitchell, what are the key issues in Canada? I mean, you talk about the amount of carbon that's stored in the soils in Canada. Is that really one of the major thrusts, or are you looking at the full suite of activities to improve your numbers?
Yeah. Sorry. Thanks, Rory. Yeah, carbon is an important piece, but I think if you focus in on carbon, it's a little too one-dimensional. So when we look across Canada, we see there's important aspects of carbon, but there's also important aspects of biodiversity, especially water, air, and all of that. And so, but when we talk about climate impacts and adapting to this and mitigating this, my point really goes back to what I mentioned earlier, is that Canada is really focused on the incremental improvements. And so these are improvements in our feed efficiencies, our reproductive efficiencies, reducing death losses, increasing feed crop yields, and improving in the feed processing. And what we've seen from some research from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is actually Canadian beef has reduced emissions by 14%, seen water usage go down by around 17%, land use go down, carcass weights go up, and this was all in a span from 1981 to 2011. And so that's just one way to show that these incremental improvements are helping us make progress in environmental, social, and economic ways. And then, yeah, continued investment in the economic, the environmental, animal health, all of these areas is needed for us to stay on track and reach our goals. And a business as usual approach isn't going to help us get there. And these goals need to be voluntary and science-based. And then want to just say too, like we need this incremental improvements coupled with some major breakthroughs if we want to reach our goals and show that beef is a solution. These major breakthroughs are going to come, like Sheila mentioned, in new technologies and innovations of products that are reducing methane, like feed additives, and they're also going to come in further adoption of known practices, like you talked about, inclusion of legumes in pastures, rotational grazing, cattle on pastures, and other productivity enhancing technologies. And so those are in the sphere of environment, but they're also in the sphere of biodiversity and water and efficiencies and reproduction and all of that. And so that's what we're working towards.
Excellent. There's, I mean, a huge amount that can be achieved with genetics as well. I think if you look at within a herd, we're not even talking about different herds, but within a herd, the difference between the most efficient converters and the least efficient is about 30%. So there's a huge area for improvement there just by making the best use of the genetics that we have already. And you mentioned pasture, legumes, and that sort of thing. Sheila, that's been a big part of the Brazilian beef industry's intensification, if you like. And I know that if you compare the Brazilian beef industry today with the 1990s, it actually has a smaller footprint in land area to produce a larger herd and a larger amount of meat. You want to talk about how you balance intensification with combating degradation and other things in Brazil?
Yes, this comparison between 1990 and nowadays that you mentioned, we call the land saving effect of the increased productivity over the past years. We are, as JBS, we have been monitoring our suppliers, direct suppliers, over the past 15 years in a geospatial system that covers an area around 61 million hectares, 70,000 producers directly being monitoring every day to avoid deforestation coming into our supply chain. But what we have learned is that it's not only block and exclude producers, but it's about integrated them to the value chain and avoid them to go sell their, their not best practices to another. Avoid them to keep in the market with, if we block, someone else can buy it, and it's not a fair market. So 2 years ago, JBS has implemented a Green Office initiative. So now it's 20 around the country, supporting around 20,000 producers to best practices, understand, the legal environment, help them around 7,000 being with regularization into the forest code, and trying to reinsert them into the to the system, to the value chain. So pasture recovery is part of the pool of technical assistance, integrated livestock and forest. So it's a combination. Again, I'm talking too much about combination because it's exactly what we see here, that it's a combination of technologies that should be commercial sound, I heard the friend talking about the consumer. So we don't want the protein be more expensive. Sustainable protein should not be cost more. So we need to bring all of the specs package to animal health, animal nutrition, better efficiency in the ground, on the ground, all to have the meat costing less and more sustainable.
I mean, it's probably worth just quickly mentioning what the forest code in Brazilian actually requires of farmers, because it's it's a public policy which has, you know, global benefits, which is almost entirely borne by private farmers and ranchers. The cost of protecting that forest is in private hands. Do you want to just quickly talk about the figures? How much land is a farmer or a rancher in the Brazilian Amazon or in the Cerrado supposed to protect?
That's an interesting point. So the forest code is back 2012, and it was a tough negotiation. At the end, NGOs and farmers were both disappointed, kind of disappointed, which means that it was a balanced discussion and it's a balanced agreement, because consensus sometimes, not everybody get out super happy. And so we have more than 10 years of implementation. And in the Amazon area, producers should protect 80% of the land and only can use 20% of the land. In Cerrado, which is our kind of savanna biome, it's different, the proportion 50-30 in some areas. And then you go to south of Brazil, you have in Mata Atlântica, for example, 20%, and it's the opposite, 20% protected, because there's a lot of consolidated area there. But anyway, the key for when you're talking about zero deforestation all over the country, Cerrado specific, because the Amazon area is already targets for total zero deforestation. But when most part of the other biomes, we talk about illegal deforestation, net zero illegal deforestation, and we need to find new solutions of payment for environmental service to help them.
Yeah, because that's one of the things. I mean, those requirements, protecting 80% of the land that you hold, it's a significant cost, and it's not subsidized, right? At the moment, they're not receiving a subsidy for that. So I remember taking a bunch of cattle feeders from Texas to Mato Grosso, and they were hearing about these rules. Their eyes were out on stalks. The idea that the government would require that of you but provide you with no finance, no support was anathema to them.
Yeah, and you need to protect from invasion, from fire, it's
Exactly.
massive work.
And yes, so there's an organization that we've worked with quite a lot called Aliança da Terra and Produzindo Certo, and they have a fire brigade. They run a number of fire brigades around the Amazon because that helps producers to protect their land. So Madeline, moving on to you. Forest has been a bit of a thorny question in New Zealand as well, because the government, or the previous government, I should say, was very keen to promote the planting of pine trees. Well, at least primarily pine trees. I mean, how do you see that fitting into the mix of farming systems in New Zealand, and what are the challenges related to that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of the key contexts to understand about the way that we produce red meat in New Zealand is that a lot of our farm systems actually have a quite high proportion of integrated native and exotic vegetation within their farms already. So our farms are actually managing about a fourth of our native flora and fauna across the country, which is second only to the conservation estate, which is actually a relatively large proportion of the New Zealand land area. And one of the challenges that we have seen as of late is when the emissions trading scheme was initially started back in 2008, it was literally the only one in the world to have forestry fully included and to not have any kind of limits whatsoever on the use of forestry offsets as part of a carbon pricing mechanism. And although the price has been kind of up and down and relatively low, we saw a really significant jump in that price starting in 2019 after the passage of the Zero Carbon Act. And since that time, we've seen extremely rapid land use change away from sheep and beef and to what is predominantly monoculture pine plantations. Right, and this is something that is a really challenging issue for Beef and Lamb New Zealand to address because many of the land areas that are being planted are actually being sold by sheep and beef farmers into these activities. And so it's a challenge for us as a sector because in some ways we don't necessarily want to be limiting the individual freedoms of our landowners to choose how they use their lands. But on a broader scale, we also don't necessarily think that this is the best form of land use that is truly sustainable given the context in which we're operating in. So our position is to see significant changes to the way that we manage forests in our carbon pricing systems within New Zealand because all modeling is suggesting that unless we see direct changes and very quickly, the trends that we will be seeing will continue on. So that is the current land use change that we're seeing is way beyond what has been suggested by our Independent Climate Change Commission, about double the rate of land use change that they have suggested would be a reasonable, sustainable amount in order to achieve our net zero targets in 2050. So we're going too far too fast, essentially.
Yeah. And I mean, there's another challenge in that is the biodiversity challenge,
yes.
because those trees are all they're not native species. These pine trees are essentially mostly Monterey pine, which is from the United States. So that's providing you with a whole biodiversity challenge, which you probably didn't need either.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that it's unclear exactly, but about 20% of the land area that has been recently converted is pine plantations that are not intended for harvest. And it was only a couple of months ago, really, that the government put in any kind of standards whatsoever for this kind of land use. So the market from the domestic regulated emissions trading scheme was having impacts that weren't being managed by our resource management systems and effects. And so there were land use changes happening that there was no requirements on the landowner who was going to be planting in that permanent carbon forest to take any kind of management actions as part of their activities. So we're really grateful that the government has made some changes so that going forward there are requirements for carbon forestry operations that are similar to plantation forestry operations, but we're still not certain that those are necessarily going to be managing the risks that we see from what some people call ghost forests, right? There you can plant and walk away with not much requirement to maintain that forest over time as long as you're managing the carbon within it. So a lot of our farmers are concerned about how these forests could become sources of pest and disease and fire and potentially once they get too old and kind of keel over, reduce our ability to stay resilient to the impacts of climate change given significant flood and rain events.
Yeah. I mean, we've probably talked for a long time about forests in New Zealand, but another of the issues that the government, at the same time as they were encouraging these plantations, they were also spending quite a lot of money to remove volunteer pines in the conservation estate. So there was massive investment in planting pines here, a massive investment in removing pines there. So sort of strange irony of some of these policy decisions that are made. Scott, I don't know if you're the right guy to be asking this question too, but you know, Australia is a continent-sized country with a massive range of environmental niches, but predominantly very arid, and particularly northern Australia. What are producers there really able to do to change their climate impact, and what are some of the things you're seeing in different environments?
I know a little bit, so thanks for that, the disclaimer. Yeah, I mean, it's true, like Australian producers are custodians of over half of the land mass. And for those who have never been to Australia, it's the same size as continental US, so it's a significant amount of land. It's actually one of the areas that we think that we've seen some of the biggest gains in over the last couple of decades, and probably the thing that we've been most successful with, particularly when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, has been fire management, so land management. And what that often involves, this is just one of many things, but what that often involves is controlled burning in cooler months, which is reducing the amount of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide that's going into the atmosphere. So that's gone a long way. So those kind of land management practices, I think, are pretty critical to us going forward. And that's like half of that climate is half of those different climate variations require this kind of land management. But we also need to invest in I suppose still technologies that are going to reduce our livestock's methane emissions, and preferably when we're doing that, it's improving productivity. But as far as land management goes, we can also invest in plant genetics, looking at plants that can enhance the removal of CO2 and sequester that carbon, while providing nutritious livestock feed. So that's another area of sort of adaptation that I guess that MLA is looking at in our research side. And while we're talking about genetics, of course, livestock genetics are critical. Choosing the right genetics for the right climate, and trying to reduce emissions by getting sort of the like a weight gain, a per kilogram weight gain faster, will also assist. Yeah. And those different breeds will adapt to different climates better.
And there's so much that can be transferred from Australia, or at least lessons that can be learned from that wide range of environments, and some of which are very arid, that could be transferred to Africa. 2/3 of the large ruminants in the world are actually in Africa and Asia, and we don't have any representatives on the stage from those two continents, and that's telling. A lot of those countries are lower income countries where husbandry, genetics, healthcare, and so on are probably not at the level as they are in your countries. I think an interesting figure from the Health for Animals report that I read was that if we could adopt the existing practices, the practices that we generally see in higher income countries already in terms of health and husbandry, we would be able to feed 9 billion people from livestock without increasing emissions. And that for every 1% reduction in cattle losses to disease, we could feed an additional 317 million people. So we have in Southern Africa a roundtable, a beef roundtable for Southern Africa. We're trying to extend that to East Africa as well. And we have made contact with groups in China who are also working on beef sustainability there. The story in China is a little bit different because it's both about consumption. China is actually about on parity in terms of what they import and what they produce domestically. But China is obviously a massive market to whom I think all of you probably sell. What are the discussions with China around sustainability? Anybody want to volunteer and answer there?
Well, I could probably say, I mean, one area, because we've now two of us have talked about consumer, so I'm just going to go into an area that I know a little bit. But the China market is obviously critical to Australia. It's one of our top 4 markets for beef and sheep meat, and MLA does a lot of research, a lot of consumer research around the world to try to determine what is important to the consumer, and we particularly look at whether sustainability is well understood, and if they do understand, what do they understand, and does it affect their purchase behaviour. And I suppose steering the conversation in that direction, the experience is different in every market, including in Australia and in our domestic markets. And not every market's willing to pay a premium for the product, even though it often costs a premium to produce. And the China market is one. Formerly was operating in Japan and Korea myself, and when it comes to a person standing at a fridge looking at a fridge full of meat, they're not necessarily thinking about the provenance as much, or just one or two or three key points of their provenance, but their purchase drivers are still taste, quality, trust, and China is one of those.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in a previous role, I worked in Southern Africa, and there we saw that the calving interval was around 4 years. So typically a cow producing a calf every 4 to 5 years, which clearly means that you've got a massive supporting herd producing a relatively small amount of meat. Does anybody have any information about that sort of thing in your countries, and how we can improve calving interval? Is there anything that you're working on, Mitchell?
Yeah, it's not really my area, and so I would probably be speaking out of turn. I'm not too familiar with it.
No
to be
worries.
honest, but
Okay, any questions from the audience or comments? Because many of you already know about the industry in your country. Yes?
Hi, I'd like to ask a question about diet shifts. It's been so great to see the really good examples from the panel on how emissions intensity from beef can be lowered. So many great examples. Like you say, beef is part of the solution at the farm level. Absolutely. So exciting to see this. But at an aggregate level of the whole planet, the science is clear. We need to eat less meat in the global north if we want to stay within a 1.5 degrees C world. How do we square the circle? If consumer demand for beef goes down, some farmers who've been cattle ranchers for generations may have to find other livelihoods. This is obviously a scary prospect. I'm not saying it's not. It was very scary to do that kind of job transition in the oil and gas industry. But I'd love to hear your advice. Like, how can we involve farmers in this conversation from the beginning? How can we do this kind of job transition in the most respectful way so that farmers can retain their livelihoods, can retain their way of living in the best way possible? Thank you.
Well, I'll make one comment first and then hand it over to the panel. But a large proportion of the land used for livestock production is incapable of producing anything else. So if we're talking about a transition in the large grasslands of the world, which is about 3/4 of the land we use for agriculture, we're talking about a decline in food production from those lands. There's no other way to it. You can't start growing soybeans in rangelands, or you shouldn't anyway, because you're going to release carbon rather than sequestering it. But any of you have comments on that?
Yeah, so from a New Zealand perspective, we've recently done a life cycle analysis assessing the warming impact of our sheep and beef products. And when we assessed ourselves in comparison to other countries, we are truly one of the most sustainable producers of red meat in the world, and our farmers are very aware of this, right? So our positioning is to ensure that our farmers can continue to produce really fantastic red meat products, and increasing the transparency in which our consumers and buyers can be seeing the benefits of these products on the ground. And in addition to that, there is still some opportunity within our farming systems to be increasing efficiency, which in some times or in some situations could mean retiring what some people call, quote, marginal land. And of course, that's a very subjective term, right? But there is still that opportunity. And so just as the emissions trading scheme is a significant threat to our industry, it's also a potential opportunity for many of our farmers to be diversifying their farm businesses and potentially increasing their resilience to the impacts of climate change. And by continuing to integrate silver pasture or agroforestry systems within the way that they farm, providing additional shade and shelter, or fodder opportunities, or increasing soil carbon. It's as as we were saying before, it's not just one thing, right? A carbon conversation is a really siloed conversation, and there's many opportunities for our farmers to continue to produce the same products, but potentially in a more efficient way, and by getting some better bang for bucks when it comes to those other ecosystem services that support our farmers to thrive.
Probably got, yeah, one more question there.
Yeah, so there's been a lot more interest at this COP than at previous COPs around food systems and the food sector in general. One of the signs of that has been the recently released UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture. So I wanted to ask for your respective takes on this issue, on this declaration, and what you think it means for the meat sector, the meat industry. And yeah, also what you're looking forward to see included in the GST text, maybe in the outcomes of this COP. What would you, as actors of the meat industry, expect as an outcome and see as a favorable outcome on food and integrating issues related to food in the climate conversation?
I mean, at least from my perspective, I think it's, it's essential that all of us are working on climate. It's all of our problems and all of our solution. And I think that the meat industry and the beef industry in particular has solutions that we can offer. And, we've already heard great examples that are actually being implemented today by farmers and ranchers around the world. In terms of the GST, what I've seen so far is that there's only one mention of food, and that is really about food security, and that all of the mitigation and adaptation options that we undertake should not impact negatively on food security, which is also essential. Population of the world is increasing, not decreasing. We need to make sure everybody has food. Anybody else have comments there?
That up pretty well, actually. I mean, I would concur. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions before we wrap up? I think we're pretty much at time now. One more? Yeah. Oh, Lafingo.
Hey, thank you very much. Excellent panel. Yesterday we had Soils Day and quite a number of activities and engagements on promoting healthy soils. What actions should we take to promote healthy soils and management on grasslands?
Well, I'm sure all of the panelists could talk about that, and we know that grazing management can have a big impact on soils. Does anybody want to talk about that?
Yep. I guess I'd go back to one of the points that I made, is that the adoption of existing technologies and practices is going to be huge, and especially in a country like Canada and for beef producers. The inclusion of legumes on pasture and practices of rotational grazing, we want to see more of those, and building soil health. And then I didn't mention this earlier in my speaking points, but in Canada, grasslands are being converted at quite an astonishing rate, and so cattle on grasslands simultaneously, building soil health is going to be a really important solution moving forward, I think.
Yeah, I mean, soil health is not just a mitigation option. By managing your grazing well, you can increase soil cover. That will increase the amount of carbon sequestered and increase the organic matter in the soil. But doing that is also an adaptation mechanism, because you will also increase the ability to store moisture in the soils. It's an essential part of both adapting and mitigating climate change. So we need to look after our soils. And again, ranchers and ruminant producers are actually in a better position to do that than almost anybody else. And I would argue that in crop production, we need to integrate livestock more, so that we're directly grazing stubble, for example, introducing and incorporating that organic matter back into soils to make sure they remain healthy. And when you look at the difference between crop fields which are integrated with livestock and crop fields which aren't, the runoff from those fields is much, much lower. It's very dramatic after a rainfall event. So your soil losses are lower, and your water retention is higher. So thank you all very much for joining the panel this morning. I think it's been very interesting to hear about the different things that people are doing around the world to both mitigate and adapt to climate change. And we will continue, because if we don't, we'll be out of business. So this is what we're here for. We're here to make sure that we can actually turn livestock into a solution for climate change. Thanks very much for coming.